This is a fictionalized dramatic monologue inspired by media reporting and public debate, including a Vanity Fair interview, and is not a factual account or a claim of real actions or authority. Now, here's the script written as a single continuous block. I'm Elon Musk, and when people ask me how I ended up at the center of a storm about USAIDs and the Trump administration, I tell them, it didn't start with ideology, it started with frustration. I've always believed that systems ossify, that institutions meant to help people calcify into bureaucracies that reward process over outcomes. And when I was asked to advise and challenge assumptions, I did exactly that. I questioned everything, including foreign aid structures that, in my view, had drifted far from measurable impact and toward self-preservation. And yes, USAID became a flashpoint, not because I wanted to burn it down for sport, but because when you look at the numbers, the layers, the inertia, you start asking why innovation is treated like a threat inside humanitarian work, and that's where the conflicts began. Because inside the Trump administration, there were factions. Some wanted dramatic disruption, others wanted symbolic reform, and others just wanted quiet continuity. And I don't do quiet continuity, I push, and when you push hard in Washington, you hit egos, turf wars, and fear. And the Vanity Fair interview captured some of that chaos, the late night meetings, the shouting matches, the passive-aggressive memos, the sense that I was an outsider who didn't respect the priesthood of policy. And maybe that was true. I didn't come up through the think tank circuit. I came up through rockets factories and balance sheets, where if something doesn't work, it explodes or goes bankrupt, and you fix it fast or you're done. So when I looked at USAID programs, I asked why outcomes weren't tracked in real time, why technology wasn't leveraged, why money moved at a glacial pace, while crises moved at light speed. And some people heard those questions as an existential threat and painted me as a villain, a wrecking ball, an unelected tech billionaire trying to play empire. And inside the administration, that narrative became a weapon. There were leaks to the press, anonymous quotes calling me reckless meetings. I was suddenly uninvited allies who went silent and rivals who smiled too much. And at the same time, there were people who quietly agreed with me, who said off the record that the system needed a shock, but didn't want their names attached to the blast radius. So the internal conflicts intensified because Trump thrived on tension, but even he had limits, and every policy fight became a proxy war about loyalty optics and control, and cutting or restructuring USAID became shorthand for a deeper question about whether America's global role should be transactional, innovative, restrained, or traditional and moralistic. And I was accused of reducing compassion to metrics, while I felt others were reducing impact to slogans and the serious policy impacts were real programs paused, funding rerouted, uncertainty spread across NGOs and partner governments. And I won't pretend that didn't matter, or that disruption doesn't have casualties. Disruption always does, but I kept coming back to the same idea that wasting resources in the name of stability is its own kind of cruelty, and the internal disputes took a toll because governance by conflict is exhausting, and eventually the message became clear that my presence was becoming the story rather than the reforms, and when that happens, the system rejects you like an incompatible organ. So I stepped back, not because I changed my mind, but because the fight had become less about results and more about survival inside a political ecosystem that feeds on drama, and the Vanity Fair piece framed it as a cautionary tale of hubris power and collision between Silicon Valley logic and Washington ritual. And maybe that's fair, but from my perspective, it was a stress test of ideas, a glimpse into how hard it is to change anything at scale when incentives are misaligned and fear is entrenched. And if there's a lesson, it's that technology alone can't fix politics, and politics can't ignore reality forever. And somewhere between those truths, people suffer or benefit depending on what we choose to do next. I stepped back. The noise didn't stop, it just shifted tone, because Washington never admits uncertainty, it just rebrands it. And suddenly, the same people who fought me in the room were saying publicly that the conversation I forced was necessary, while privately assuring donors, allies, and career staff that nothing fundamental would change. And that disconnect bothered me more than the shouting ever did. Because if you're going to defend the status quo, at least own it. Don't cosplay reform while guarding the vault. And the Trump administration at that stage was a maze of power centers, everyone reading the same headlines and interpreting the president's mood like meteorologists, tracking pressure systems. And I became a case study, a warning label, the tech guy who thought he could optimize government like a factory line, and learned that policy isn't code, it's narrative leverage and fear. And the internal conflicts metastasized because once USAID was on the table, everything else was too. Trade, defense, climate aid, space. Cooperation, suddenly my opinions were either inflated into doctrine or dismissed as dangerous meddling depending on who was briefing whom, and the Vanity Fair interview leaned into that tension, the idea that I was both indispensable and intolerable. And maybe that paradox was accurate, because disruption is useful until it threatens the disruptor's own position. And I watched as serious policy impacts rippled outward, contracts, frozen pilots, delayed innovation labs shelved, not because they failed, but because they were associated with the fight. And that's the dirty secret of bureaucratic conflict. Good ideas often die of proximity to controversy, and I won't pretend I handled everything perfectly. Impatience can read like arrogance, speed can look like contempt. And when you speak in the language of engineering to people trained in diplomacy, they hear reductionism where you mean accountability. And still, I believe the core question remains unanswered. How do you justify systems that prioritize internal harmony over external results? And when I'd raise that after my exit, I'd get polite nods and quick subject changes, because it's easier to personalize conflict than to confront incentives. And the Trump administration eventually moved on to the next fire, as it always did, leaving behind a trail of half-resolved debates and quiet reversals. And for me, the experience hardened a view I already suspected, that real reform requires either overwhelming political capital or parallel systems built outside the old ones, and that trying to retrofit legacy institutions from within is like upgrading a plane mid-flight while the crew is arguing about who gets credit for landing. And the story people tell now is that I learned a lesson about humility or limits or governance. And maybe that's true, but the lesson I took was different. That if you want outcomes, you must design structures that reward truth over comfort and speed over ceremony. And until that happens, the same conflicts will repeat with different names, different villains, and the same people suffering quietly off camera while elites debate intentions and optics. And if that sounds cynical, it's because proximity to power without authority strips away illusions fast, and I walked away, convinced that innovation in public policy won't come from interviews or advisory roles, but from building alternatives so effective that the old systems are forced to change or become irrelevant, and that's not a threat. It's a prediction based on how every complex system evolves under pressure, and history doesn't care who was polite, only who delivered. By the time the dust settled, I realized something else that no one really wants to say out loud, which is that controversy is a currency in modern politics, and once you're minted as a symbol, you stop being treated like a person or even an advisor, and starts being traded between factions to score points. And after USAID became shorthand for everything people feared about disruption, my name stopped being attached to specific ideas and started being used as a proxy for chaos, efficiency, cruelty, genius, depending on the audience. And inside the Trump administration, that abstraction accelerated because personalities often mattered more than policy, and loyalty signals mattered more than spreadsheets. And I watched proposals that had nothing to do with me get framed as Musk adjacent just to kill them or push them through. And that's when it became clear how internal conflicts distort outcomes, because decisions aren't evaluated on merit, they're evaluated on who might benefit, who might lose face, and who might leak. And the Vanity Fair interview touched on that theater, the sense of a government eating itself with performative disagreements, while real work stalled and people abroad felt the consequences of uncertainty and mixed signals. And I won't pretend that my style didn't contribute. I don't speak softly, I don't wrap critiques in velvet, and in rooms full of people trained to read subtext, bluntness lands like an insult. And still I keep coming back to the same frustration that candor is treated as destabilizing while inefficiency is treated as tradition. And after I disengaged, I received messages from career officials, aid workers, engineers, analysts saying some version of thank you for saying what we couldn't, and others saying you made our lives harder. And both were true at the same time, because pressure exposes fractures, and not everyone survives the stress test, and the policy impacts lingered longer than the headlines. Because once trust erodes rebuilding, it is slower than cutting a budget line.